Alrighty then. As the highlighted section on our timeline indicates, we've got a lot of history to cover. So, diving straight in, we'll begin with the major events that led up to Earth's first glaciation. From there, we'll continue through the milestones that set the stage for the second Snowball Earth event. Earth's first global freeze is technically called the Huronian Ice Age. You'll also hear other terms used when scientists describe Snowball Earth events, names like water belt, panglacial, or even slushball Earth. Each reflects different hypotheses about just how frozen our planet really was. To understand why our planet became its first snowball-like form, it contrarily began while the planet was heating up. And if we remember back to the end of episode 2, when I spoke about a few of Earth's earliest life forms, one of them was methanogenic archaea. So, picking up where we left off, the byproduct of methanogenic archaea is methane, and its chemical symbol looks like this. And so that we're all speaking the same language, atomic symbols are the shorthand scientifically recognized symbols utilized on the chart that we've all heard of. It's called the periodic table. And chemical symbols are the scientifically recognized symbols used to represent instances of elemental bonding. Cool. Now, as time passed by, methanogenic archaea's asexuality began to add up. The exponential procreation of these methane makers caused an accumulation so great that methane became the atmosphere's dominant greenhouse gas. Then, the earliest versions of cyanobacteria evolutionarily burst onto the scene, and they possessed photosynthetic metabolisms. As I described in episode 1, this type of metabolic process releases oxygen as a byproduct. As time passed, these earthlings also did lots of asexy things, and so they too multiplied. Congruently, so did the quantities of their byproduct. As our young planet's oxygen levels increased, it inevitably came into contact with the aforementioned atmospheric methane molecules. When these two molecules, methane and oxygen, react together, they become three: one carbon dioxide and two water molecules. Using chemical symbols, this is what the reaction looks like. Now, to better understand the full picture, during the Archean eon, Earth's sun was a few billion years younger than it is now. So during that phase of its maturity, it probably produced between 15 and 20% less luminosity. However, that said, methane is still very effective at trapping in atmospheric heat. For that reason, scholars are teaching future scholars that methanogenic archaea caused the high temperatures of pre-cyanobacterial times. Then, the depletion of methane, caused by the addition of atmospheric oxygen molecules, is their primary suspect for why the temperature on Earth began to drop so suddenly. In other words, the cyanobacteria did it. So visually, the reactions of methane and oxygen caused Earth's heat-capturing greenhouse blanket to become significantly thinner. Now, it's important to know that though cyanobacteria certainly seems to be the largest global cooling cause, there were other factors at play as well. For instance, scholars say that geology was also a reason why Earth's blanket became thinner. They say that during this period of Earth's history, there was a lot of tectonic plate activity, which likely caused additional volcanic eruptions to occur. These earthquakes and eruptions would have caused occurrences of crustal breakage. When this happened, freshly broken crust rocks became exposed to the atmosphere, and during these instances, silicate rocks became a global cooling factor. You see, because the atmosphere was becoming dominated by carbon dioxide, it increasingly reacted with the freshly exposed silicate rocks, and now we find ourselves studying a chemical reaction known as silicate weathering. Scholars say that this chemical reaction was a rather significant influence in Earth's first freeze, so we'll review this diagram to see how. But before we get started, I have a forewarning. This bit is elementally technical, therefore most of us will only gain a general perspective from the coming explanation. And for our purposes, that's totally fine. What needs to be understood is that the cycle exists and that it removes atmospheric carbon molecules, which leads to the further weakening of Earth's greenhouse blanket. For this reason, scholars teach future scholars that silicate weathering was significant to this particular cooling event. So, bear with me while I try to keep this bit short, sweet, and as detailed as possible. By now, chemistry nerds have already recognized that the example type of silicate mineral, detailed in the diagram, is freshly exposed wollastonite. Okay, so here comes the technical bits. atmospheric carbon dioxide dissolves in water, forming carbonic acid. This weak acid partially separates into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. When carbonic acid then reacts with wollastonite, the hydrogen ions facilitate a breakdown of the mineral, releasing calcium ions, additional carbonate, and dissolved silica. Bicarbonate ions are transported to the ocean primarily through river runoff. Once in the ocean, bicarbonate reacts with calcium ions, producing forms of calcium carbonate. Then, when calcium carbonate becomes supersaturated, it precipitates in the form of minerals like calcite, which then settle into deep ocean sediments. Silicate weathering and carbonate precipitation both play critical roles in regulating atmospheric CO2, and they contribute significantly to Earth's long-term carbon cycle. Now that we're aware of its existence, we can understand how silicate weathering removes atmospheric carbon, causing it to be an agent of coldness. So to recap, we've already noted Earth's once thick methane-filled greenhouse blanket had become more and more like a feebly thin carbon dioxide-filled blanket. And well, because of silicate weathering, we now know that Earth's atmosphere was also going through a reduction in carbon dioxide. And frankly, an atmosphere that contains neither of these greenhouse gases has no greenhouse blanket to keep it warm. So, Earth's temperature was definitely in decline. Okay, so we understand that methane and carbon are atmospheric particles that cause Earth to retain heat. So, now we'll get into the particle types that cause the opposite to happen. Atmospheric particles that reflect the sun's radiation away from Earth are described as either reflective or scattering aerosols. Different types of reflective aerosols include sea salt and sulfate. As I've already mentioned, our younger Earth possessed more frequently shifting tectonic plates and thus increased volcanic activity. Well, both of these geological activities likely caused Earth's subsurface to release additional aerosols, plus there was also a more lively contributor to Archean aerosol pollution. To the degree of its significance is widely disputed, however, the earthling that's known for causing increased atmospheric aerosols is called sulfur-reducing bacteria, and it did evolve onto the scene during this period. The earliest forms of sulfur-reducing bacteria, or SRB, thrived in anoxic marine environments, so they were anaerobic microorganisms, and they drove sulfur cycling by converting sulfate into hydrogen sulfide. During the Paleoarchean era, extensive SRB activity depleted oceanic sulfate while releasing hydrogen sulfide into water columns. In regions of ocean upwelling, some of this hydrogen sulfide escaped into the atmosphere. Once in the atmosphere, the hydrogen sulfide underwent oxidation, forming elemental sulfur and sulfur dioxide, which further reacted with the atmospheric water vapor, generating sulfate aerosols. It's this increase in atmospheric aerosols that may have had a climatic impact by reflecting solar radiation back into space, thus potentially contributing to the cooling of Earth's surface. So the increase in atmospheric sulfate aerosols could have amplified global cooling trends. Then again, scholars cannot say for sure. It's possible that neither of these factors was significant enough to make a considerable difference. But it can be said reflective aerosols certainly do not warm the planet. So, the process could have played a role in triggering or sustaining snowball Earth conditions by driving prolonged reduction in surface temperatures and disrupting the greenhouse effect. When scholars clocked the timing of when organically produced sulfur aerosols began entering Earth's atmosphere, they discovered that it would have occurred during the coinciding snowball Earth glaciation, the ozone formation, and the Great Oxygenation event. As I've clearly stated, it's presently unknown whether these aerosols had a substantial impact on these coinciding events, but scholars do think that there's enough information to continue this line of questioning. Therefore, it would be an avoidance not to mention it. As the planet cooled, glaciation began to form and spread from the poles toward the equator, and increased ice coverage causes an increase in Earth's albedo. So, in order for us to understand this era's peak coldness, we need to learn what the albedo effect is, and also what's technically known as a positive feedback mechanism. You see, as temperatures dropped, ice coverage increased, reflecting more and more sunlight, causing further cooling in a self-reinforcing cycle. But now, I'll describe one of microbiology's most interesting and recently discovered clues. In this article, published January 3rd, 2024, we find details of new findings concerning the evolutionary development of thylakoids. But first, I'd like to credit Emmanuelle J. Javot and all those affiliated with her international elite research projects. Those associated with this consortium continue to inconspicuously provide worldwide scholars with new details illuminating microbiologists about the origins of Earthlings. And now that I've made mention of the worldwide elites, I'll get into this fascinating article that Emmanuelle is jointly credited for authoring. In high school biology classes, students are taught the functional purpose of thylakoids within modern-day plant cells. They're intracellular membranes that are specialized for photosynthesis. But in the most primitive cyanobacteria, thylakoids were not yet present. Photosystems are protein complexes that capture light energy. The article suggests that these light-capturing protein complexes penetrated beyond the cell membrane, later developing into these layers referred to as thylakoid membranes. The authors found that acquiring sulfolipid-sulfoquinovosyl-diacylglycerol biosynthesis pathways correlated with thylakoids emergence. This discovery is important because with the non-vesicular lipid phase transition in place, astrobiologists now have a better framework for re-examining the role of companion proteins in non-concentric thylakoid biogenesis. Utilizing the article's newly discovered clues, estimates now infer that thylakoids evolved within cyanobacteria about 2.4 billion years ago. As shown here, the authors discovered evidence indicating that thylakoids dramatically escalated early Earth's atmospheric oxygen production. And, as mentioned earlier, oxygen production greatly contributed to the reduction of atmospheric methane levels, which weakened Earth's greenhouse blanket, causing scholars to realize that the earliest forms of Earthling species were dramatically more impactful to the earliest global glaciation than previously presumed. The microfossil images in this section are of 1.75 billion-year-old cyanobacteria that the article's authors recently identified in Australia. When these astrobiologists applied the data from their new findings, they advanced several theories within the field of molecular phylogeny, which is the study of protein evolution. The first example of this is that they added validity to the scholarly estimates of when oxygenic photosynthesis first appeared. They substantiated that this occurred approximately 3.5 billion years ago, and that this form of metabolism existed in the most primitive form of cyanobacteria. In other words, they think that photosynthesis was the mutation that caused the evolution of cyanobacteria to form its own branch from the ancestral tree of life. And the authors also provide evidence that proto-cyanobacteria originally thrived in environments that possessed no oxygen. In other words, the earliest forms of cyanobacteria were anaerobic. Because of the toxic effects of oxygen on anaerobic lifeforms, those that thrived were most successful when oxygen was avoided. Over time, some cyanobacteria evolved the ability to overcome the toxic effects caused by oxygenic environments. In Episode 1, I detailed the importance of margin for error in self-replicating molecules. This tolerance for mistakes, or variations in replication process, benefits all lifeforms because when environmental obstacles arise, lifeforms become pressured to mutate in ways that enable them to overcome the difficulties set before them. This cellular attribute causes evolution to continuously produce Earthlings that are more resilient than those that came before them. Then, the article's authors also explain that the evolution of thylakoids in these lifeforms had caused all possessing it to produce significantly more oxygen than their predecessors previously had. Microbiologists are still learning about the effects that these evolutionarily developed cyanobacteria had on advancing our young planet toward the first snowball Earth, as well as the Great Oxygenation Event. If you're interested in the nature of reality, then make sure you click the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on all the future uploads. And if you appreciated diving into the rock-solid evidence today, please also hit that like button.